So it's a real pleasure to introduce Dmitri Nikulin, who is a professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York City. Dmitri is the author of many books. I mentioned just the last few. He published the concept of history in 2017. He published Neoplatonism and Late Antiquity in 2019 with the Oxford University Press. Critique of board reasons. I remember we had many conversations on board on Benjamin and Heidegger and so on. That was published in 2022 with the Columbia University Press. And now is working on a new manuscript, a new book that is a non-being in ancient thought, forthcoming for Oxford University Press. And talk is delivering today is a part of the new project, the non-being project, and the title is a part of it, the Inscrutable Scrivener on the negative constitution of action. Please join me in welcoming Dmitri. You are.
All right, thank you, Max. Thank you very much. Thank you, you and Vano and all your colleagues here in the philosophy department for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. So far, I admire everything I see here on campus, and thank you all for making time. I thank you those who are now consumed for making time to come and listen to this talk. So this, as Mike said, this is part of my general interest in negativity and the way I started with ontology. Now it's I'm trying to understand action as constituted by its negation or negative. And so Bartleby, who is being addressed in a number of recent publications and became a much debated topic, by Deleuze, by Agamben, by Branca, Archich, and so on. I think this is the best, this is really the definitive New York story and narrative. I'm not quite sure how it fits the West Coast narrative, but for me, this is really, although it's a fiction story, but it's one of the best diagnoses and critique of modernity and modern state of capitalism that I know of. And so what I'll be presented today is both close reading and interpretation of this novel. So it's published, was published in the end of 1853. Melville's short story, Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street, that's about Wall Street, describes an out of the ordinary encounter in the life of a commonplace lawyer, when the appearance of a seemingly inconspicuous yet ungraspable young man changes the narrator's life forever in a way that he is able to tell, but ultimately not able to explain and understand. The entire story is a suspended attempt to say the unsayable, to present the non-representable in its negativity that inexplainably breaks into the ordinary existence, yet cannot be understood and accommodated by everydayness, which fights back by closing itself off to action and even beyond action. So the stage of the narrative is that everything is strangely negative in the story. The place where it is staged is fascinating, busy during the day and eerie at night, with the limits within the limits of the familiar New York space of Wall Street and its surroundings, the most prominent of which are the church, Trinity Church, and the prison, which existed at that time. The locus of the story is the lawyer's office, or chambers, as we used to call it. There are still Chambers Street in downtown. Manhattan at Wall Street, nothing but ordinary in its appearance and dull in its stillness, a place where nothing seems to happen, but in fact much is going on. The space of the office is a projection of the busy outside world, contracted into twilight floor, originally inhabited by the narrator and his three scriveners. It is relatively well ordered despite the occasional disruptions by the individual idiosyncrasies of its inhabitants, but becomes disturbed in its regular course by a new scrivener, Bartleby, who is at first hardly noticed. The office is squeezed between the walls and has a view on the walls of adjacent buildings. The second scaled-down microcosm of the office that reflects the macrocosm of the busy legal business world of Wall Street is a whole universe split into two by ground glass of the doors, as Melville tells us, on the one side of which is the location of the scriveners, and on the other side of which is the semi-private space of the lawyer, in which he carves a semi-hidden place for Bartleby. So the scrivener's place that defines him as a scrivener is his desk. And yet, Bartleby's place that especially shows the character of no place behind his screen is a character of no place, kind of utopia, you could say. When he arrives in the office, there is apparently no place for him among and with other scriveners, so that the lawyer puts him behind the screen on his part of the office. So Bartleby cannot be seen, and for this most part, not even heard. Noiseless, as Melville says, noiseless at any of these old chairs. Only occasionally, when addressed directly, can Bartleby be heard. However, he always comes up with the same response, which is thus not really a response at all, but rather an attempt to respond to his own repeated and repetitive response in order to be finally heard. But the narrator is not seen either. We do not know how he looks like, we only hear him. In this sense, he unwillingly assimilates himself to the absconded Bartleby. With the advent of Bartleby, the dull conventional office turns into an enchanted place inhabited by seemingly common yet very colorful characters during the regular working hours. But during the off hours, it becomes haunted by a strange creature. So no one has a name in this story. It's named then either by social function, the grubman, the turnkey, or by a token that has become emblematic of position, or by a nickname, the three scriveners whose monikers Turkey, Nicholas, Ginger Nuts, strangely arrived. The narrator himself is nameless and refers to himself only as I, which is not a name but an empty universal placeholder. So one never has a name for oneself. So the name refers to one's social inscription, yet does not communicate what I perceive as I. So I never have a name for myself. I never name myself to myself. The only person who seems to have a name here is the protagonist of the story, yet Bartleby is the last name, which is a generic and can apply to any member of the same family or to a namesake. Bartleby is only a sound indactylic token, that refers to and addresses the other. So no one has a biography in the story. No one has a name, no one has a biography. Except perhaps for the narrator himself, but what he tells us about himself is only a very sketchy version of the professional curriculum vitae, touching on the business without mentioning any personal or familial background, with only a brief self-descriptive description of himself as an eminently safe man. Yet nothing stands out, nothing out of the ordinary, an ordinary legal servant like many others around him. Only a few facts or rather anecdotal stories are known about the other three scriveners who appear more with picturesque characters from a commedia dell'arte. But Bartleby has no biography at all. Perhaps he is not even capable of biography. He cannot have it, or no such biography can be told. A written description of Bartleby's complete life is impossible because he has no complete life. understood as the course of events. One is unexplainably made present. Two, but even a few episodes cannot be related consistently because although seemingly simple, they are utterly elusive. Bartleby's being among others doesn't become being with others, only being by others at best, since others cannot accommodate being which is the other to the disparate commonality of bystanders. They may share an anonymous life, but although they have nothing in common with each other, this may still be written as a common biography. So Bartleby's life defies the existing genres of biography because his life doesn't fit any familiar description or definition of life. As the course of events once is unexplainably made present, or even as bare life. So the narrator cannot submit either a historiographic or antiquarian description of Bartleby. His personal evidence does not bear witness, since he appeared in the appearance of that which can only be approached and described negatively. So not only does Bartleby have no biography, he is incapable of autobiography either, because he is entirely unirreflective, or appears to be irreflective, devoid of any kind of reflection or reflexivity. In his abstention from from life while still living, he does not provide and is incapable of providing any account of himself. There is literally nothing in Bartleby's life that can be told about. Yeah, this nothing is the nothingness that makes him alive while appearing dead among the living, who are dead to being while appearing alive. So Bartleby is thus entirely ahistorical and abiographical, because being already dead for the world, he cannot fit any of the currently recognized narrative genres. In a sense, every stranger and passerby in the street has no name and no biography for us, and remains such until we come to meet and know them. But only Bartleby forever remains a stranger without a proper name, but only a named nickname and without biography. So appearances in the story do not disclose everything either. Nameless, the narrator himself has no face, only the voice. We hear him, but we do not see him. Before describing the chief character, the lawyer deems it necessary to briefly describe himself, his employees, office, yet he fails in doing that, because in Bartleby's presence, everything becomes dim, insignificant, and washed out, and thus can only be described negatively by a slight hint at that which denies and suspends the hinted, a shadow wall, a shaking desk, and oily coats, which both hide and partly disappears, a conventional character of the play. But we can hardly imagine how Bartleby looks. He always appears in negative relief. Everything positive about Bartleby eludes us. He is always intelligent, so to speak. Bartleby appears pale. That's what the narrator says. He is pale, as if coming from a different world, something of a spook, a living reminder of death, looking thin and pale. He has, as the narrator says, lean visage. His face was leanly composed. His leanness points towards it, but doesn't capture Bartleby's character, again, which is why trying to grasp the ungraspable, the narrator keeps returning to various meanings of the lean, which he keeps repeating. Bartleby transpires dimly through a privation of positive features in a description that cannot pinpoint him. He appears a pale clerk, reminding of the pale plaster of Paris bust of Cicero. So there's always this connection with Cicero, which will come at the very end, that decorated the office, as if the bust was his twin, equally mute and elusive, coming from a different time, placed there by sheer accident. Yet Bartleby's Egyptian innocent Palo, which is Melville, innocent Palo, looks suspect to the government when Bartleby himself becomes a suspect of committing a crime that does not exist and cannot be imputed to human, namely, of being other. In his pale elusiveness, in the deficiency of colorful details, Bartleby remains blurry and cannot be clearly seen and distinctly accounted for. Now, what about his gender? The entire novel is inhabited and dominated by men. Remarkably, but not surprisingly, there are no wives, lovers, prostitutes, mothers, daughters, nieces, or female acquaintances in the text. The only exception is, as Melville says, a woman residing in the attic, which person weekly scrubbed and daily swept and dusted my apartment, who likewise doesn't have a name, doesn't have a biography, or any distant appearance. Surprisingly, but not remarkably, Bartleby does not fit within this all-out male world. He has no connections with women, but no bonds with men either. His gender remains not ultimately defined, in fact. Identified by others as male, he doesn't show any signs of the expectedly masculine behavior. He suspends the conventional gender division, which was traditionally allowed only to saints and angels, who, however, are not tolerated by busy modern life and are displayed into unexpected corners known perhaps only to explainability. Yet Bartleby is neither a saint nor an angel, but an inexplicable intrusion of indistinguishable otherness and incomprehensible negativity that upsets the well-ordered ways of the city. In his being almost not identifiable, Bartleby causes dismay and wreaks havoc in the world of meticulous writing, accurate legal composition, and precise monotonous reading of the written documents by the homophonic choir directed by the lawyer. Now, Bartleby's illusoriness shows itself in immobility. This seems paradoxical because once something is steadily established in the same place, it cannot evade our attentive regard. Yet, although being there in one place, Bartleby is never there, always escaping any objective and objectivizing description, we will see him, but we cannot never concentrate our gaze on it. Somehow, Bartleby is always out of focus. His first appearance is that of a chorus, Greek chorus, a motionless young man. So Bartleby is motionless, which he stresses and recognizes. He says, "I like to be stationary." He doesn't move. The world moves around him, but he keeps standing, remaining in his sanctuary, into which a part of an ordinary house has been transformed by his absent presence. So the epitome of Bartleby's immobility is standing. For long periods of time, when time disappears or gets suspended and appears only in the ellipses, Bartleby will stand still, looking, as the narrator says, upon the dead brick wall, long continued motionlessness, standing in one of those dead wall reveries of his. Late in prison, he was seen again standing all alone on the quietest of the yards, his face towards a high wall. Now, standing still, Bartleby unwittingly assimilates himself to Socrates. So, standing motionless for a long time, as we know from Plato's Symposium, thinking about something to himself, or maybe not thinking at all, not achieving any thought in thought. But there he is. And maybe there can be no account of self-account of his thought, or rather non-thought, during this time of the suspended motion. Staying motionless in thinking amounts to non-thinking as the non-doing of thinking, which is the activity of doing nothing, including nothing in and of thought, which does not amount to a finely formulated thought and thus does not get registered within a reflective account. But this is the most difficult thing to achieve and to do or not do, inaccessible and incomprehensible to others, routinely moving around and thinking in established way. So Bartleby has his own temporality, which he does not own or appropriate from others, but which suspends the time of as long, busy, and boring duration. This is his kairos, what we used to say, also the due time, appropriate time, the due measure of action, which chooses non-being of the standing still. He suspends action as inevitably inscribable into a universal temporality in favor of non-action, which neither negates nor responds to a particular action. Such non-action is not an action from the modern point of view. It's not an action at all, since it doesn't have an object, task, purpose, or agenda, and in fact suspends and eliminates the modern universal autonomous actor. Yet this non-action has both its own logic and a different temporality, not synchronized with the universal linear one, in which a task can and should be laid out, planned, and directed towards its completion. So the narrator stresses that Bartleby, he says, was always there, so always there. Yet standing still in one place, he is never there, but is still there where one does not and cannot think. So the answer to the question, where is Socrates? This is Plato, where is Socrates? Where is Bartleby? Is nowhere. Not in the place one is standing, but not anywhere else either. So Bartleby's Socratic standing is a not-thinking demonstration of, as the narrator says, and I quote, his steadiness, his freedom from dissipation, his incessant industry, his great stillness, his unalterableness of demeanor under all circumstances. Such standing non-thinking appears as staring at something unremarkable and non-seeming, a brick wall or in Socratic case, an unassuming neighbor's porch. So therefore, we could say that this place is a not place where one is not by not thinking. So paraphrasing Descartes, we could say this: ubi cogito ibi non sum. Where I think, there I am not. Towards the end of his life in prison, Bartleby says, I know where I am. We do not know what he is, and most probably he does not know either. But he knows that he is there where he is not. So all attempts at berighting Bartleby of the environment, appearance, and the circumstances of his short life do not disclose anything about him. So one can only deride him and depict him apophatically. Bartleby cannot be described in his elusiveness because his being is not being with others of this socially ordered world, but is being by others who are greatly disturbed by his absence in his presence, and thus eventually have to get rid of him. So what does Bartleby do, or what he's supposed to do? What is he doing? What he's supposed to do? Write. Writing is his whole existential in the lawyer's office. This is not the romantic kind of creative writing that we teach nowadays, that is supposed to express one's most intimate, unique, and precious thoughts, feelings, and aspirations. This is a mechanical copy of what others have written. As the narrator says, proverbially a dry, husky sort of business. Compulsory, following established written patterns, standards, and formulas employed since times immemorial in the legal profession. Such a writing is propelled by a client's extra written interest, to which the written gives legitimacy and incontestability. So Bartleby is a scrivener, a copyist, the one who scribbles something that he himself probably does not understand, at least not fully understand, but he does not have to. He only needs to repeat what has already been repeatedly written in a slightly different form, again and again, in the form of a legal testimony or argument. Such a repetitive writing, copying, cancels and suspends itself. In a sense, writing becomes a form of resistance to the meaningless, repetitive social world in which Bartleby finds himself immersed for a reason no one can explain, thus for no reason at all. So Bartleby is a written being who sticks to writing as to a saving line. Sometimes he has to read the written aloud with others in order to proofread the text. Yet this writing doesn't presuppose reading, but rather exclusive. The writing is silent and solitary, whereas reading in the lawyer's office is out loud and in unison. Reading aloud was the only way of reading in antiquity. They never read with their eyes. When the written legal, political, dramatic text was publicly presented within the equally public dialogical mutually interrupted debate. But the modern reading aloud usually occurs in an artificial setting, like this one, for example. It's externalizing the same solipsistic reading that excludes the other and asserts one's cogito as the internal ultimate expression of one's solitary existence. So even spread among several participants, the modern reading is a homophonic proofreading of the multiple copies of a text, a very, as the narrator says, a very dull, wearisome, and lethargic affair that is meant to make sure that all the copies of the identical and not numerically not numerically different. The copies should be a practical proof of the identity of the non-discernibles. Such a choral reading resembles a strange legal prayer in the office, which is transformed into a temple of the law. A reading aloud, which Bartleby refuses to do, thus does not presuppose that the uttered becomes a common enterprise. On the contrary, it is a multiple monologue, which, when copious voices follow and repeat after somebody else, in this case, anonymous voice of a legal document. So orality once invades the monological narrative of the novel through an oracle that the narrator hears at the corner of Broadway and Canal Street. When a voice says, "I'll take thoughts," he does. And then it proves to be oracle in the story. So very soon on his third day in the office, Bartleby was. He refuses to participate in the oral explanation of the written documents that ultimately legitimizes them, preferring the silent written repetition of copying to the oppressive practice that makes people indistinguishable and unheard in their utterances. So thus, as the narrator says, he writes, and he wrote on silently, palely, mechanically. So Bartleby does writes, but does not read. He firmly abstains from reading. Bartleby has leisure, but he's never seen reading, not even a newspaper. Perhaps he might be dyslexic, but Bartleby does not want to read. He's capable of reading, and yet he cannot read, or cannot read aloud what he has written because it is not his, for nothing written can be his. He's deliberately an illiterate writing being. He's illiterate writing being. Bartleby is writing, but not speaking, not much anyway. But then he stops even writing. He stops reading, and he stops writing, becoming silent, immobile, catatonic. No more, he says. No more writing, as he starts losing his sight, becoming blind, or turning his eye away from everything superfluous that might be seen, done, or made by, but without which one is better off. At this point, action halts and evaporates. No signs anymore, not even an illusion mark, only a hint at an ultimate negation. And so why is he so disturbing? The most outrageous and challenging of Bartleby's actions is the non-action of his famous speech act of "I prefer not to." This is the most famous one. Nowadays you can see actions as students with inscription, I prefer not to, they have tote bags with so on. So it become commercialized. For the first time, it comes when Bartleby refuses to examine a legal paper by reading aloud in company with other scriveners, replying to the request, as he says, in a singularly mild, firm voice. I would prefer not to. The immediate narrator's reaction to Bartleby's response, both to its semantic message, refusal to war, and pragmatic aspects, firm and quiet resoluteness, is surprise, dismay, and consternation, which results in a momentary paralysis. As he says, I sat a while in perfect silence. I prefer not to seems to end any form of communication, both verbal and practical, and puts others in a state of silent stupor, which, however, they cannot endure for long. So Bartleby's preferring not to challenges the very moral foundation of modernity, based on the firm adherence to duty, which he apparently seems to neglect. By refusing to do the assigned work, Bartleby trespasses the seemingly unshakable foundation of human civilization, namely, whoever doesn't work doesn't eat, which in bourgeois modernity is interpreted as whoever does not sell his work doesn't eat. So he doesn't eat, or hardly eats at all. So the lawyer can see him eat only a handful of ginger nuts a day that are secured for him every day for a few pennies by another scrivener whose name is also ginger. But Bartleby does work in the beginning and then stops. So basically, it exemplifies no work. But rather than being inspired, he stepped in his place that he secures for himself by merely and barely being there. So I think his being is barely there, which negates or at least suspends working or even doing something. He does not act or acts by non-acting. He does not do anything, or rather does nothing. Thereby asserting that being as being there where he is placed, and he finds that this place doesn't require production and itself cannot be produced. He is a solitary, anonymous revolutionary who is not understood, is rejected, and is suppressed by a society based on the ideal of action for production. Bartleby's quiet presence that transpires in preferring not to and not acting not only challenges the lawyer's professional reputation, it creates a quiet scandal that undermines the very basis of the society based on production and exchange that ultimately defines human worth and dignity. So now, renowned and appropriated into commercial circulation as an inscription as T-shirts and tote bags, I prefer not to is not a formula, as Deleuze snappily yet inappropriately called it. Bartleby's response is not rigidly formulaic, but has a great many variations on the same theme. There are more than 20. I would rather not to. I prefer not to. I prefer not. I would prefer not, and so on and so on. So many different versions. So Bartleby's queer what we narrators way of calling it, proves to be so powerful that it takes over the language of the entire office. When others involuntarily and almost compulsory start repeating and using prefer, which becomes the word. As the narrator says, that's the word. In this way, Bartleby, as he says, turns the tongues, if not the heads of myself and clerks. Against their wishes and desires, the narrator, which is a spell on everyone, the narrator himself recognizes that he cannot get rid of it and keeps using it all the time. He says, somehow of late I had got into the way of involuntarily using the word preferred upon all sorts of not exactly suitable occasions. The word puts a spell on everyone around. So thus all the dialogues and exchanges with others Bartleby is involved in are kind of minimalist, yet such informally consisted of only two rejoinders. The question originated by another, and Bartleby's answer always negative. So there's even one extended dialogue when the lawyer comes back and offers Bartleby different jobs, which he unsurprisingly rejects one after another, which astonishes the narrator, because for him this displays, as he says, unwanted worthiness. Strictly speaking, after the negative I prefer not to, Bartleby often completes a dialogue with silence. No answer, no reply. He remained silent. He answered nothing. He made no reply. So the first reaction of the lawyer is to I prefer not to is silence and immobility. I said a while ago, silence is, one could say that the dialogue finds its completion not only in a verbal negative response, but in a performative silent non-action as the ultimate response that does not close a dialogical communication, but rather opens it up to an inexhaustible set of meanings of the said and the acted or not acted. So now can apply to any verb, any rejoinder, but preferring to is not an abstract negation that applies to any action and any enunciation at any time. It has its own proper time, or kairos, they say in antiquity. When the lawyer attempts to an entrance to his own headquarters on Sunday, Bartleby responds behind the door, "Not yet, I'm occupied." According to the lawyer, as Bloch, not yet is the formula of the utopia that is to come. Yet, I prefer not to is never to come, but is always already there, pointing to the presence that overcomes mere presence in its absence, in its time. So it's always a response to somebody, to something else. So it's a kind of, it comes with a pure form of dialogical communication. Similarly, flatly negative and repetitive throughout multiple variations, I prefer not to is not a dismissal of others and a refusal of communication, but a pure form of dialogue that points beyond dialogue. It points towards the unfinalizable character of dialogical exchange with the other and the self as other that cannot be objectivized or extinguished, but can only be affirmed negatively. So the non-action of preferring not to is thus more powerful than a concrete determinate action driven by a reasonable choice or a justifiable purpose. This is why Bartleby is, as the narrator says, more of a man of preference than assumptions. More of a man of preference than assumptions. So preferring not to is not preferring to do A instead of to do B, or not even to do X, where X can be any action, but just to do, which is an action indefinite, without a definite object, task, agenda, and or even a subject. This is a non-action or of not to that suspends any action, making it non-action. I prefer not to, thus might be understood as I choose nothing. But if this is a choice among an infinite number of possibilities, nothing can be chosen. In his preference for non-action, Bartleby does not choose at all. This is a choice that chooses nothing, a preference that does not prefer anything or chooses not to act. If one prefers not to act, nothing can go wrong. And so I prefer not to neither asserts nor cancels the will, but suspends it in the act of I prefer not to will. This establishes a logic of non-preference rather than a logic of preference, as Deleuze claims. For the rest, this is a logic of preference, but I think this is really a logic of non-preference. But the non-preference of what? Of nothing. Therefore, preferring not to is a preference that does not prefer anything at all, and therefore prefers nothing, and as such is non-preference. Preferring not to is a refusal of the will to will, a non-volition, the self-suspension of the will. Only thus does the will become free of itself as free and autonomous will. Now, when addressed, Bartleby doesn't explain why he prefers not to do what he's been asked, only that he prefers not to do it. So most probably he doesn't know it himself. The self-suspending will gives itself no reason for doing or non-doing it, since it doesn't need one. Now, when addressed, Bartleby says 3 times about himself over the whole story, I'm not particular. This is not a reflective assertion of one's individuality or particularity in the self-humiliating attempt at self-belittlement, that is in fact self-aggrandizement as always. This is an apophatic statement that denies any particularity to a person who thus cannot even refer to oneself as oneself. In other words, this is a negation and suspension of the I. This means that Bartleby has no essence, and thus cannot be grasped or defined, which is why he is so troubling and irritating to others. Moreover, he has almost no existence, or has a minimal one, a bare existence that is barely existence. But Bartleby does not think about himself, because strictly speaking, there is nothing to be thought. He has no essence, no distinctive what. He is thus immediate to himself, because mediation is being and thinking, in being and thinking presupposes the distinctive and distinct what, and is where each one can be mediated in thought, which thus becomes reflection. For reflection presupposes distance, and distance presupposes thought that overcomes, closes the gap between being and thought, and between thought and thought. This means that Bartleby does not think at all, although he does not know it either. He thus thinks the unthinkable. He does not act. He is present in the moment by being always and forever absent, anytime. He is there, but he is not there. Non-acting Bartleby appears entirely passive. Abdicating his will, he thereby also renounces any resistance. Thus, when taken by the police and sent to prison, to the Tombs, which is now destroyed, but its police headquarters are still there. It is where they take undocumented people these days. Yet his humble passivity is perceived by others as passive resistance. This is the narrative, passive resistance, which deeply troubles and irritates them because it does not fit and cannot be understood within the accepted moral and social norms that promote activity and encourage making oneself busy. One has to be busy all the time. One has to do business. And this thus visibly useful to the entire process of exchange and production. For this reason, nothing, as I quote, nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance. Nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance, especially if it comes from a person who is, again, quote, perfectly harmless in his passivity. Therefore, in order to interpret the act of not action or non-action through passive resistance that escapes understanding and interpretation of rational judgment based on the accepted norms, one should use imagination. Yet imagination doesn't help either because one cannot imagine a possible motive behind the passive resistance for which the one who passively resists cannot give an account either. So it is in his entire passivity, Bartleby remains not only unaccountable, but also unimaginable. So the tranquil non-resistance cannot be overcome because, strictly speaking, it does not resist at all. But precisely because of that, it is the most powerful form of resistance to persecution and the most efficient form of critique of oppression, as, for example, it is in Tolstoy or in Gandhi. In his passive resistance, Bartleby refers to be idle. So he is idle. He exemplifies idleness, another great sin of modernity. Although he does not choose to be idle. But remaining idle, is he ever bored? Standing transfixed in the middle of the room like a column of an ancient ruined temple, or spending hours by the window staring at the wall, he doesn't show any symptoms that he could interpret as boredom. Probably he's never bored, while everybody else around him is deadly bored. And the lawyer himself recognizes that the work in his office is dull, as he says. This is not surprising, since the entire legally outlined and morally prescribed productive life is utterly boring in its repetitiveness. However, being idle, Bartleby is never bored, not even by the others incapable boredom, because he is deeply immersed in non-acting, which remains concealed from others and even from himself. Yet idleness is a grave sin in modernity because it is considered a refusal to be an active, productive, and thus earnest member of the society, a hindrance to the promotion of the still greater growth of wealth, which, however, cannot be properly and equally distributed and thus cannot be enjoyed by everyone, or maybe by anyone in the end. The ensuing poverty, and Bartleby is poor, he is poor, is then taken to be the fault of whoever prefers to remain idle. Bartleby's abandoning and renouncing any work and doing nothing in the office, his visible idleness and practicing of non-doing or non-acting while remaining visibly passive, is a severe affront and offense to the utterly serious modern responsibility-ridden, duty-oriented, and work-obsessed morality. Therefore, he cannot fit the project of morality, obviously, remaining dangerously resistant to it, undermining its very foundations and thus being a passive revolutionary. That's not the narrator, that's me. His idling passive resistance is not an act of civil disobedience, but rather a non-act of passive resistance. So he appears as a kind of monk of Wall Street. But is he? Bartleby is neither a saint nor a holy fool, which requires a voluntary choice of self-abdication, whereas Bartleby does not choose to non-act because it cannot be chosen. No one around is capable of receiving and holding Bartleby's enunciation, for he does not really have and leave one who's wholly withdrawing himself from the world. He does not and cannot sacrifice his life for others who do not accept him, and so his entire life appears to be in vain. Or at least this is the life that cannot be told, and thus cannot be understood in religious terms. Perhaps it can only be hinted at apophatically, and the narrator can only recognize his inevitable failure in not being able to tell the story of the wondrous yet inscrutable Bartleby. Now, if Bartleby barely is, and he barely is, we cannot learn much about being from him, especially since he does not reflect on being of his existence or actions. If Bartleby is the embodiment of negativity, as I take it to be, or of non-action, that is an action that negates or suspends action, we could at least hope to learn about negativity from it. In prison, which is the place that negates place as the place of motion, because it is the place of compulsory confinement and involuntary immobility, the narrator says to Bartleby, says, quote, "Nothing reproachful attaches to you by being here." Nothing attaches to Bartleby, literally. And he is not attached to anything, and he is non-action and non-preference. But negativity without being is nothing, and thus nothing can be learned from it. If the life regulated and driven by Wall Street, in the life regulated and driven by Wall Street, being and action escapes us, who are objectivized in and through thought and reflection that are instituted and practiced in many ways, social and political, yet do not allow us to be and act even barely. Modernity is marked by the incapacity for being and its recognition, and I would say also for incapacity for action. Being becomes negative, elusive, and can be reflectively understood or accounted at all. So being and the good, which in modernity is associated with moral action, remain severed from each other, as we already see in Kant's practical philosophy. And so the good cannot be considered the source and origin of being anymore, as Plato called it beyond being, epeikenetesousias in the Republic. Since being does not transpire in reflection or contra parmendes, thinking and being are not the same. Being is nothing. As bare being, it is almost nothing, which is why it cannot be grasped by the narrator and other people around Bartleby, who is exemplarily unreflective. But is Bartleby a good person? It's hard to tell, because he stands silently outside the modern ordinary morality and moralistic judgment, stubbornly and staggeringly neglecting and negating its normative principles and the call of duty through his non-action. He's just standing there in silence. Bartleby is ungraspable in his goodness, of which he is, let's say, a prelate. He is the ungraspable goodness itself, which is beyond the everyday root and light. So Bartleby is both a symptom of modernity and its negative diagnosis, which neither we nor he can grasp, but which stop short of its full indictment by suspending judgment in the not to, unable to quit or get rid of the troubling presence of the goodness in its absence, and the withdrawal into the not to, the narrator and the people around him eventually expel Bartleby, make him disappear from their sight, burying him alive in New York's infamous prison, show the tombs. where he is led to be by a strangely silent procession that contrasts with the hustle and noise on the streets. Here, Bartleby dies. The inscrutable and profoundly troubling Bartleby has to go, so people around him let him die. Death is the negative expression of negativity as the final closure that negates being and overcomes non-being, pointing towards nothing. In a sense, Bartleby is already dead while being alive. To the world and the others around him, when he turns up on the threshold of the lawyer's office, which is why he always looks pale and pallid, appearing to others as this is called cadaverously, gentlemanly nonchalance, yet with firm and self-possessed. Yet withal firm and self-possessed. Not living among those who claim to be living, he cannot have a biography or definite description. Even the only known episode from his past life comes from the death letter office, which by the way still exists, highlighting the obscurity of being dead while still living. And I have to say, dead letters doesn't not sound like dead men. Or perhaps everyone else is already dead, and Bartleby is the only one who is alive. But only when Bartleby dies in prison does he become forever alive, turning into the lawyers and maybe ours too ultimate alter ego, with the emphasis on the alterity, on the ego, the unlikely and impossible friend, the other who will accompany the narrator until the end of his life. Death comes as a silent encounter with nothing, after which there is nothing to say. During the last conversation in prison, Bartleby says to the lawyer, "I know you, and I want nothing to say to you." Saying nothing is the ultimate form of dialogue, a pure possibility for a further discourse that will eventually resolve into nothing, but will then resume again and again without a repetition of content. Death resolves into nothing without achieving it, because nothing can be achieved in and after death. This is the dialogue that all amounts to silence. The turnkey, the Tun's itself, could say, tells the narrator who is looking for Bartleby, who is still there, being no more. He says, "Are you looking for the silent man? Yonder he lies sleeping in the yard there." Bartleby is lying on the grass of the entirely quiet yard, still looking at the wall, silent, and finally awoken in a profoundly sleep. In a constant awkward use of rhetorical locutions throughout the novel, the narrator puts himself under the patronage of the dead father of rhetoric, Cicero, whose pale effigy sits right behind the lawyer's head, some 6 inches above, benevolently overlooking the proper order and guarding the consuetude of the office, thus turning it into a kind of neo-Roman civil temple of legality. The very last line of the novel, the famous one, then can be taken as a solemnly sublime to write funeral oration. Our part will be our humanity, which uncannily reminds us of Cicero's famous opening in the speech against Catilina or Tempora or Morris. Yet such an ending does not provide any ending at all, but rather deplores and not spell hint at the continuation of Cicero's phrase, which goes on to say, "Hic tamen vivit, yet he lives. Does Bartleby live on after being dead? Was he already dead among the living, or was he the only one alive among the dead?" Bartleby's death is the silence that he finally reaches, and the response to any demand or question is the preferer that finally becomes mere not, where speech becomes still and silent, semantics evaporates, and syntax gets suspended. This is the moment of ultimate negativity, of nothingness that overcomes both being and non-being. Among its many connotations, namely to carry in front, pass by, anticipate, exhibit, express, Latin verb prefero has also the contemporary meaning of prefer. Also labori mortem servitude. In the ultimate preferment too, Bartleby finally negatively asserts his preference of leisure to work and death to servitude. Absent from where he is, he dies, imperceptibly to others and probably to himself, with his eyes wide open, seeing the unseen, looking into nothingness, and finally renouncing even death, silently gaining his freedom. So please, yeah.
Okay, we have time for questions and comments.
Thank you so much for this talk. This is very interesting. I've never read Bartleby by Melville, and I will do that. Yeah, and I think my question is about the claim about the Bartleby is non-action and like the way that you describe it to be kind of nothing, right? But I feel like it's not fully nothing because he occupies a space, right? At the end, like he's in the office, like when the lawyer moves out because he's like, okay, this guy's not moving out, so I should do that myself. And then the new tenants move in and they find him to be nuisance, but he's there, right? He is something, even though he is just not being treated as a human, as you said, that maybe it's not their life, but like at least it's an annoying object, occupying space. And then after they manage to move him out of the office, he's sleeping in the hallway and the stairs. So I'm assuming that people are just like still going around him or just jumping over him, but he is something, right? So for him to be completely nothing, maybe if he was just in the middle of the forest and wasting away, then I'll say, okay, that is nothing, But he is being seen, like that's why this can work as some kind of resistance, because so that's why resistance somehow still involves being something, right? It involves some form of being, because otherwise, if it was truly nothing, then that resistance will never get registered at all, right?
Okay, good. Thank you. That's a very important question. But I think I didn't say that Bartleby is nothing, but I was trying to say that by being there, he exemplifies nothing through his action or non-action, not doing so. Definitely he's there, so he's very concretely and densely present. He, for the most part, he cannot be heard because he prefers to be silent, only saying I prefer not to. He writes, but then he stops writing. He can be seen, but not often, because the whole space was divided into two. So one is 3 desks of 3 scriveners, and the lawyers are there, and he makes on a very little space for Bartleby. So you cannot see him either. So for the most part, he's not seen, he's not heard. Sometimes he goes out. He even tries to go to the church, Trinity Church, but it doesn't manage to go there. So he clearly is in place, but this is again kind of no place at all. He's not really an object, and so I think this comparison. On the one hand, in that part of the office, you have a bust of Cicero, which is a pale. So Bartleby is pale, so a clear kind of reference to the pale bust of Cicero. Bartleby pale in appearance, but he's not a thing. He's not an object. It's something that is there. It's not an object, but we don't know. It's an intrusion of sheer nothingness or otherness into people's lives, and they cannot get it. They cannot grasp because he's so different from everything they have ever seen, heard, experienced, or talked to. That eventually they cannot even bear. They have to get rid of him. That's why he was always there, but not by not being there. And so his act of he's standing. He's standing still, and it's very much reminds of Socrates in this catatonic state. Later describes this twice in his dialogues. One when they go to symposiums, everyone is having a party, having their time, and somebody is just standing outside. at the neighbor's door, and well, somebody tries to bring him out, and somebody said, no, let him be there. He will stay there for a while, and then he will come. Plato also describes a situation when Socrates spent the whole night just standing, doing nothing. We don't know what he was thinking maybe. And this, I think, is standing there without doing anything in particular, is really his absent presence or present life being absent, which is so disturbing because he breaks all possible prescriptions, moral rules. He just doesn't want to work. He doesn't want to act with any intention or any purpose. And this becomes so disturbing that basically they send him to die. So I think he is not nothing, but nothing is something that he represents. But because nothing is nothing, it's deeply disturbing. So we are accustomed to something, to some funny things, but then in horror, the sheer nothingness, we become deeply disturbed.
Robert, big, violent, and nice.
Thank you for this talk. This is really interesting. So one aspect of your talk I take you to be trying to think through or explore, it might be called something like the conditions under which there can be successful non-action.
Mm-hmm.
But there's sort of two different kinds of successful non-action that I heard you talking about. And I'm curious about the difference between them and maybe the relationship. So one would be an example where so some things you can only successfully accomplish by not trying to do them.
Mm-hmm.
And classic examples from, philosophers' work on this, things like forgetting and falling asleep.
Mm-hmm.
That you're more likely to succeed at the act the less you try to do it, right? You have to not try to do it, and then you're more likely to accomplish it, right? But the reason why you could say there's like a form of successful non-action there is metaphysical in a sense. That is, it's proper to the thing. It's proper to forgetting or to sleeping, that it requires non-willing. So there's a kind of connection at that level.
Mm-hmm.
But a different kind of successful non-action comes about because of like very specific historical or sociological circumstances. So this is the more classic, like kind of Marxist reading of Bartleby, is that if you live in a society that constantly instrumentalizes your willing, then you can't defeat that society by trying to defeat it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to not try. And that's the only way to escape the instrumentalizing of your will, right? But the reason why the success criteria there is very different. It's very historical and not metaphysical. And so when you were talking, sometimes it sounded like you were talking about this, reading Bartleby as like a Buddhist might be, right? Non-willing as a kind of metaphysical problem, and other times more as a very specific historical or sociological condition that creates an odd circumstance whereby only by not trying can we successfully defeat a society that instrumentalizes our own will against us.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. This is an excellent question. It's a very good observation. I think mindfulness is the both and neither. In the first sense, when we say somebody accomplishes by not doing something, not trying, so forgetting from sleep. I have got many of my students interested in baseball, and they keep telling me that you're doing best when you don't really think about swinging. German, it's true. Letting you also, and then you act by essentially not acting. You achieve something that you're meant to achieve, but not thinking, not concentration. I would say he's not. It's not that kind of action. Although there is definitely, if you wish, a metaphysical aspect of his non-doing, which is universalizable. Because if it is indeed the case, and so my claim here, basically, maybe I didn't state it explicitly, but my claim is that you can action is constituted through non-action or the negation or the negativity. Only then it can be possible and can be understood as such. So non-action is primary to action. So in that respect, yes, there is this aspect to Bartleby. The second, the Marxist aspect, well, yes, to some extent, as I said, that Bartleby is a critique, about the analysis and critique of modern society, of capitalist production, because it happens from Wall Street. And when I was writing this essay, I went all over the place with described it. Many of them still exist, they're still very busy, especially with Wall Street, really is embodiment of contemporary capitalist production, which always has is on purpose. So this is definitely a critique of it. So this is again, as I said, kind of intrusion of negativity that is there. It yet cannot be captivated, understood by a contemporary world, because it's structured in such a way that it already is meant to reject it. Although it comes as a very powerful critique, but I think in the end it is not in vain, because his being or his absence, being by absent there, is really a very powerful critique. So in some sense it's both and it's not neither of these two aspects. But it's a very good distinction, I think.
Thank you for this talk, and thanks for giving us an opportunity to reflect on this text together that still, I think, speaks to our world today very much.
Mm-hmm.
So toward the end of the talk, you made a passing reference to Bartleby as a monk and then as a prelate.
Mm-hmm.
And you're careful to not ascribe any kind of religiosity to Bartleby, in the sense, in the way that word is likable to us today. But I wonder if it's worth thinking more about at least the monastic form as a kind of form of life that makes Bartleby's negative presence legible. And I think there's two reasons for doing this. One is it's in the text. There's the narrator refers to Bartleby's room on more than one occasion as a hermitage, and he's also behind the screen, which evokes the screen of the cloister boundary. And the second reason is that it's a form of life that is premised on negation and the negation of the self, and it's a way of withdrawing from the world within the world, and doing so monastic community a presence in the world that gives those outside of the community an opportunity to visit and gives visitors an opportunity for a kind of reflexivity. I mean, even if you think about proper hermits who really withdraw from the world and are living in the desert or something, people still go and visit them for wisdom. But there's a real sense of Bartleby like being in the world, but not of the world. He's in the office, and one other reference that is really funny is when the boy comes to give him the ginger nuts, and the narrator says he eats the ginger nuts, and ginger is hot and spicy, but Bartleby doesn't himself become hot and spicy. But this is like a really troubling presence for everybody around him, including one of the, I forget if it's Turkey or the other, the one with indigestion. The indigestion seems to be a symptom of his repressed "I would prefer not to," and Bartleby's "I would prefer not to" sent him into a kind of crisis. So I wonder what you think about the monastic form as something that makes Bartleby.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I will read a bit paragraph for the lack of time. Which is called really a monk of Wall Street. So I entirely agree with you that there are many allusions to religion, to Christianity in particular. Again, we don't know anything about Bartleby, about his biography. We don't know whether he's religious. We know that he wants to go there, but he ends up not going to Trinity Church. So wanted him there, but something stopped him. There are some features of his life that could be interpreted as monastic. So he prefers to stay in the same place. This living almost as anchoretical, non-communicating with others, keeping silence, and preferring not to communicate with others. So he might very well be somebody who could live in the Egyptian desert in the first centuries. But then it doesn't really fit with modernity, which is very entrepreneurial. And so if we believe Max Weber, although some people say this are critical of this assessment, that modern capitalism comes out of the spirit of Protestant ethics. It's also a form of religiosity, where you do not spend everything on yourself. You consume a little bit, and I think those among the current billionaires who spend not much on themselves are you sometimes praised. I don't know why. So then you invest the rest. So you make the capital grow, although not for the sake of betterment of humanity, not for the sake of human good. There are always these religious references, but you see that they are misplaced. So maybe he could be considered a monk from the West, but he doesn't fit with his absent presence there, but he irritates everyone there. So again, this, as I said, the office, which is very nondescript building, remains of maybe a Roman temple. There's this pastor Cicero, and they read something out loud, almost a kind of legal, quasi-legal prayer. So all these references are there, but they always miss the point. So Bartleby's intrusion into this office is so radical, different that it cannot be described in ordinary terms, even in religious terms. I believe proper best is still always there. Thank you.
Dmitri, thank you so much. This was so thought-provoking and rich. I have a not very well formulated question, but one thing I was thinking about while listening to you was the role of the will. Because it reminded me of Schopenhauer's discussion on suicide and how he interprets the active form of self-destruction, not so much as a negation in the life, but in fact an affirmation of it. And I wondered, reading Bartleby along those lines, like, do you think Bartleby lacks the will to live ultimately, or he's a manifestation of the pure will in the sense of, denying himself the instinct to live, which is quite difficult.
No, this is
So I had also another thought, but I can
go ahead.
Should I go ahead? Okay. Well, I was thinking also about Agamben's interpretation of Bartleby, which made an impact on me when I first encountered it, along with Agamben's other thoughts on the negation of instrumentality, which is something that you touch upon. And I was thinking, in a sense, Bartleby's doing nothing is a kind of pure gesture. Like gesture, as Agamben understands it, is pure mediality. There's no instrumentality whatsoever. It can only be repeated in a certain way, and it's
I don't know. In a sense, I thought Bartleby is also kind of a pure mediality of existence.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm really curious, why do you think it ends in self-abnegation? You know, I think it's a curious ending because it could be very affirmative. It could be that this is the real meaning of existence, that is not instrumental, that is not done for others. So I'm curious why you think the story ends the way that it ends. Is the determining factor the act in itself there, of referring now to, or is it society's reaction to this act that is the ultimate denial of that? I mean, I don't know. I'm just curious to hear more of your thoughts on that. But thank you. This was really awesome.
Great question. So the first one is about the role of the wheel. The way I take it, he doesn't have a wheel, but it's rather maybe it's a wheel that doesn't will itself, the will that wills not. Because to prefer is to exercise your will. It says, I prefer tea to coffee, or I prefer this, I prefer a government's implication to diversity or something. So let me suggest a choice, an act of will, and the choice that is based on some rational preference. At least in that situation, you are supposed to give a reason for it. Okay, you could also say that I prefer that. Well, I just prefer. This is just a sheer act of will. Shows only what is in German is called willkür. It's just volition without any reason, without any grounds, because it's only will what it wills. But I think that for in case of Bartleby, it's just a non-will, a non-volition that suspends itself. So the ultimate negation of the will that wills not to live, evaporates and stops. And this is very difficult to grasp, because it's easier to grasp a will that wills to stop on some grounds. It is much more difficult to grasp a will that produces something out of nothing, act of production, ex nihilo. But this is really a non-will at all. So it doesn't will, and so by suspending it itself, it opens up for this non-preference. So non-preference is really very strange and a very paradoxical way of description. So I prefer not this and not that. I don't prefer anything. So the way I interpreted it was, actually I had more, but is that in modernity, will is always a thought. So in ancient philosophy, they were happy people because they didn't have a will at all. They only had reasons, so various variants of reason, discursion, no discursion. They had preference. And Aristotle said in the mathematics, if you act, you have to deliberate, and then according to your preferences, moral preferences. Hopefully. Now, in modernity, we have a will, which sometimes wills without any reason at all. So then the relation between will and reason becomes very, very complicated. And in some sense, this kind of philosophical history of will is not yet written. So my former colleague, Yeri Yobel, I don't know if you knew him. Yeah, that was his project at the end of his life, to write a history of will, but he died before that. Yeah. And so the relation of will and reason becomes very, very complicated. And so in this sense, I think this here, the decisive step comes with Kant, so that reason is only about phenomena, about appearances, and this is only this is about knowledge. So wherever we have knowledge, we have no will. Will has to be excluded. Will is delegated to the sphere of non-cognitive, non-theoretical, but practical. So in the sphere of moral action and political action, we have will. But there, what is important is to make sure that this will is rational. So it follows certain rational prescriptions that in the end, it establishes for itself autonomous. That's the idea of rational will, volitional subject. But then there's a rupture between thinking, which apparently, it will be permit this is about being and volition, because thinking is about phenomena, not about being at all, or about certain appearances, the way we arrange them through the a priori forms of perception and then understanding, and will, which is now delegated to the practical, which really is the only capacity in us that can touch on being, but this being is moral. Yeah. It is not known, it cannot be known at all, so it can be described theoretically, but it can be enacted through moral and political action. So there's a total kind of rupture between the two. And in case of Bartleby, I think he's not directly suspense with rupture, suspense will at all. So it's really, we are in an absolutely intolerable situation with his fulfillment too. Now, as for kind of Bartleby's pure gesture, pure mediality, and in the case with and his death, because in some sense the lawyer, because he's so struck by this intrusion of the other, for him this is, for the lawyer, it is a kind of a religious experience. He finally encountered something divine, I would say, in this ordinary and busy and everyday world of legal transactions, of business, being busy, that he expels Bartleby, and he knows, but Bartleby prefers to stay here. We saw on the portion in one place as a kind of monk, and then he's sent to prison, and to tombs, as somebody who has no, all the lawyer tried to find a good occupation for him, always rejected, always refused to do it. And so then when Bartleby is in prison, he provides good food for him, which is delivered at his expense to Bartleby. Bartleby refuses to eat it. And so you wrote a great book on self-immolation. But self-immolation is really on a purpose. It has a political end. And it's an intentional act, which means to establish something against the current oppressive system. So Bartleby lives in an oppressive social and political and economic system, which excludes kind of non-existent existence. And I think this is not an act of self-immolation. He simply does not fit. He was kind of doomed from the very beginning, but being doomed, in fact, means the whole world in which he inhabits. And now we don't know the reason why he visits is doomed. So Bartleby's diagnosis basically said this is a dead world without any future. So she looked at what it did to Bartleby. So he becomes a kind of martyr that this world doesn't even want to recognize.
Okay, Max and then Maria. Okay, my question is, let's say, why Max is me?
Oh, then I was wrong, because I said that no one has a name for himself.
Formatively criticized and I'm done. So the mission accomplished. So the question is why Bartleby today? What is so appealing in Bartleby's story? And I think if we ask one of the students with a T-shirt,
yes,
they would have said, "Oh, it's the force of negativity," and they like negativity. Now, now the point is what can we do with the negativity? Now I'm becoming very dialectical. You provoke me for some reason. So because negativity can be what you say a way to challenge the foundation of the modernity, or Bartleby, you say, that challenges the foundation of modernity. But I would say, yes, at the same time, negativity is what constitutes the force of modernity. The modernity is constituted out of negativity. And then one can say that the force of modernity is basically to constantly challenge itself, because modernity incorporates the negativity. As you can see, it's already a little bit dialectical and Hegelian. So then, if I go through some of the different lines that you pointed out, I can see even better how this kind of a negativity shows us basically the X-ray of the modernity. It's not something that challenges modernity, it's what is constantly behind the modernity. So, for example, you say Bartleby is not biography, and Hegel would have said, yes, of course, because the individual is the result of the chain of his own actions. Since Bartleby doesn't act, he's not an individual, therefore doesn't have biography. Bartleby likes to be stationary in mobility. And again, a dialectical mind would have said, yeah, sure. And pure being is what turns into nothing. Right. Similarly, with the temporality of Bartleby, the temporality of a non-action, that is a kind of it's a temporality that in a certain way erases kairos and emphasizes chronos, because at every single moment in chronos dissolves into nothing, into the next moment, and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of emphasis on the becoming that incorporates the nothingness. One can even say, maybe in the last point, if you want, what is the object of Bartleby's statements? I prefer not to. There is no object. It's a kind of an indefinite object. But again, this is the point in which differences turned into indifference. There is no reason to choose, because there is no difference. And there is no difference that makes difference. So my point is that yes, everything is correct, everything is right, but I'm afraid that this emphasis on negativity, and I'm not saying that it is your point, but I say the force of negativity, emphasis on negativity, is not something that challenges what we call modernity. Actually, in a certain way, the emphasis of negativity is a way to be hypermodern, because modernity is constituted out of negativity.
Thank you much. Well, it's a great question, because this is all about negativity, and it's a question of how should we understand or interpret it. But if you suggest that modernity is really constituted negatively, but constantly overcome it, I agree with this. This is right. This was Hegelian and Marxist point of view, but this is a definite negation. Kind of negation that is a sublation that always leads to bring to light something new that was already there in itself, and then it becomes there for itself. So this is a negativity that is critical of itself, is a first step of self-criticism that then eventually leads to, that's the idea, to improvement, to growth. So as Hegel says essentially that reality is not kills by negation, it grows by negation. So this is the sense of being critical. So we have to criticize the current situation, state of affairs, and then it will hopefully bring about something else which is already there, but is not fully explicit. So this is not a total destruction. Maybe, if maybe this is still an illusion in Hegel, because modernity, and especially contemporary capitalist modernity, will eventually bring the entire humankind to total physical annihilation, which we nowadays cannot exclude. But this aggressive negativity of modern capital is exactly such that it always tries to do something else. So this negativity is the idea of doing something else. Trying to be creative, trying to create something else, which in the end will pay back. Maybe not everything, but something will pay back. And then you will have this constant growth. So growth is achieved through negation. But again, this is not total self-annihilation. 1 and 2, that logically speaking is based on a very doubtful model of negation negativity in Hegel, which assimilates itself to the identity of the opposites without mediation, because they cannot be mediated, so then they have to be resolved in something else, in the third, in the singular. But in case of Bartleby, I think that the negativity is really radical.
Yeah,
it's something
that can be a frozen negativity, a negativity without dialectic. That is a frozen negativity. That is basically something that mirrors the frozen positivity. So there is a frozen being and frozen negativity, and they are both expression of a dead life.
But I think that in his case that they are not really mirror each other. Here is really elusive. It's so radical that it cannot be thought, it cannot be perceived. Bartleby is there, but he has no name, no biography. We don't know anything about his elusive. Then he eventually dies because he simply cannot fit. This is such a radical gesture of negation and negativity. This negativity cannot be thought at all. It cannot be described because I like this novel a lot. I think this is the best New York novel, and I think it still describes our contemporary situation to a great extent. And yet, Melville himself doesn't know how to describe it. In the case when we encounter something totally negative, one of the ways is to speak about being by silence, and there's a lot of silence in this, or at least allusions to silence in this novel. Another way is to use poetic language, because poetic language really suspends language in thinking, so I omitted this paragraph, but I think it's really achieved by alliteration. So Melville, he was a poet, as we know. And he used poetic means in the text to capture this uniqueness of this something utterly ungraspable by using alliterations. For instance, about Astor's name, he says, "A name I admit I like to repeat." This alliteration, I admit I like to repeat. Then, for it has rounded and all of a sound to it and rings like unfigured for this you. About the energetic turkey, he says, inflamed, flurried, lighted. This stuff else. And Bartleby, I have other examples. He uses a lot of poetic Melville uses a lot of poetic alliterations. He tries to grasp me maybe through poeticness. I don't think this ultimately this helps, but the kid is so radical. It's not the opposites, now the value of positivity is so beyond that it cannot be even grasped. Now about the how to speak. I said Melville attempted to speak poetically, but I'm not sure he managed to do this. Now about temporality. So no, yeah, I totally agree that temporality of modernity is that of Chronos. It's a time that is measured. In fact, yeah, time becomes very important category for production, for making, because production is something that has to be measured. It's according to measure. Time is money, so it must be measured. If we think about what we are doing as at the university that we are teaching, is also considered under the paradigm of production. We have produced so many PhDs or BAs, MAs. We have working hours which have strictly measured. So it's all again about production. But in case of Bartleby, as I said, it's kairos. It's the right moment when he comes with his I prefer not to. And again, so Bartleby is an intrusion of something that is so beyond any kind of definite existence that it cannot be even grasped, and it can hardly be thought, it can hardly be spoken about. The narrator is utterly stunned because he doesn't know what to do, how to act. Ultimately, there's nothing not much we can say about that.
Maria and John.
Yeah, this is really exciting to be involved in conversation. Thank you for your talk. I have several thoughts that are very not organized. And the first one came when you mentioned the question of gender, because I thought he's an abstraction, this creature. I wouldn't call him a human or a he or nothing. So I agree with you. There is something, I wouldn't, maybe you mentioned angels, saints, but I see more of a ghost, like a kind of ghostly figure of these other workers in the building. It's like, he's like something remnant of them, but not really them. So they can recognize themselves the lawyer. I haven't read it. I read it when I was in undergrad, so I probably have forgotten bits. But one of the things that makes me think about that is the absence of body, because there is nothing bodily here, nothing biological, it seems. I mean, you mentioned that he eats, but he doesn't really eat or doesn't have an. I don't remember. But does he die for lack of will, or because he just biologically cannot live like this by not doing any action? Because all the actions that he's refusing seem to be, from what I understand, all things that we consider a valuable action, but eating, breathing, all these things that we do just to exist as human biological bodies are not in the realm of what, actually is a big A, some moral or something metaphysically valuable or something like that. So it's more like this maintenance of the body, and that's something that seems to be abstract from the story. I don't know, I'm not completely sure, but it's a question. And the other one is about this question of negativity. I mean, you mentioned that, saying that if everything in the world is bad, and we consider the actions in the world to be against the good, then non-acting is a good. So in a way, his non-acting as negativity could be also interpreted as a good thing. Morally good, I mean. And one thing that you said at the end made me think again about this, because you mentioned he's a martyr somehow, martyr. But a martyr, I don't see a martyr as a negative figure, the opposite. I mean, people who, and you mentioned religiosity, like people who seeing someone a martyr, they see it as a positive action, something that you do because it's, I wouldn't have thought of martyrs as a figure of negativity, but and the other thing that I found interesting, when you were talking about temporality, your dialogue there, you mentioned both Chronos and Kairos, but For me, none of them are really what Bartleby is doing. Bartleby is more like in a kind of eternal absent present. What in the Losian terms would be the ion more than either Kairos.
Close my door.
Yeah, ion or rather than Kairos or Chronos. But no need to answer. It's just because there is so much, and I imagine it's a bit.
Maria, what was the museum concept?
Ion.
Ion.
Yeah, it's the eternal present, basically. It's the time of the surfaces, where it's not the action of the Kairos, which is like the exact moment or the moment of crisis, depending how you see it. And it's not either the Chronos or the imposed time from above. It's a time that is like this, because it doesn't really go forward, no backwards. It's basically, yeah.
That's what important.
Yeah, good. So there are a number of interesting questions or issues here. First, in terms of gender, again, I think that it has no different markers, any kind of gender. In terms of no body, he has a body, but we cannot describe. So the only the narrative describes himself living very thin body, and that's about it. We don't know how he looks. We don't know what how his face looks. So as I said, that tradition, again, speaking in the religious terms, that might be the no gender affiliation might be ascribed to an angel, because the French angels have no gender, or saints. If not suppressed, then suspended the gender. Whether he's a ghost, perhaps he might appear as a ghost, but he appears in broad daylight. So now he goes out in the street, tries to go to the church. It doesn't end there. He can never achieve anything. He can never go where he intends to go, because I don't think he can have any intentions, any purposes. He decided to go to Trinity Church, goes. He never achieves it. So the way I described him was by barely is. So he still is, but he's barely is. He doesn't have any particular essence, so we don't know what. So by which we could describe him. I mean, has no particular features, no defined, no description. So he somehow is, but in he's absent because he does have a what. And the description, again, the traditional theological term, or something that is but doesn't have a definite word, which of course is only about God. So, but he's not divine. He looks a voice even better than any kind of description. So in terms of martyr, maybe he's not a martyr because he's not recognized as such. He dies widely, and nobody is there except for the Lord. So his death is not recognized. Whether there was any kind of sacrifice or self-sacrifice, we don't know. But this the encounter between this strange intrusion of sheer idleness and contempt of the world lives in the annihilation of something that cannot be annihilated, the annihilation of sheer otherness. And if the other is not there, we cannot have any kind of life. Because if the other is not there, I cannot establish a relation with the other, I can't have a dialogue with the other. So the entire life becomes meaningless. There can be no good life, because if life is a good life with others, it's kind of suspends itself. And now finally, in terms of temporal descriptions, I was actually thinking about it, whether of course, besides chronos, which is time, also in temporal duration, besides kairos, which is difficult to translate, but is something the time of the proper time. And now is the time to have dinner. This is kairos. But now is the time to defend your dissertation after some. Now it's a very particular moment in time. I was thinking about it, whether there's a category of noon now. As Aristotle has a whole theory of how this now is, which is discrete related to time, which is continues, and then the way to describe aion, or in Latin is eternitas, eternity, something perennial, is by nunc stans, this is famous. So standing now. Yeah, so now that doesn't mean it's always there in the now. But I don't think that he is really that kind of reflection of eternity. There's nothing eternal, nothing that comes as transcending the current state of affairs. His negativity is transcending, but it's not eternity, not now, because there's nothing you can say about it. And so his time there was, we don't even know whether it was meant to be, was a total accident. But at least this kind of intrusion of sheer negativity destroys something that is indestructible. This is very paradoxical. But in the end, it shows us that there where it happens to be present by being absence is really doomed. Because it cannot accommodate it, it cannot understand it. And this is really a very, I think, profound diagnosis, which I think is also relevant for us nowadays.
We have 2 more questions. John and Jeremy. 2, actually. Jeremy.
From a gentleman.
Yeah, John and Jeremy. John first.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion. It's really very interesting. I think it's also interesting that our conversation focuses mostly on Bartleby, but the title of it is Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street. You know, Wall Street in some ways could be seen as the topic of the story. And, you know, when I think about, you know, Heidegger says that, you know, what entities are depends on the conditions that allow them to manifest themselves. So I would ask, you know, what is it that prevents Bartleby from making an appearance, from disclosing himself publicly? And, you know, in some ways, you know, I think that his silence is kind of the most eloquent of responses to a society that is so soul-sucking and negates all of the good qualities of human life.
Thank you. No, I definitely. I also think I said that he's silent, and his silence is really, as you say, an eloquent response. But why it is the story of Wall Street? Because it happens on Wall Street, and I take it that this is a profound critique of Wall Street. It's analysis of what is going on Wall Street. So everyone is very busy engaged in business, and yet nobody realized that this is a kind of activities doomed when this negativity that again this mathematical physics constitutes activity and being is somehow there. We don't know why he turns up on in this legal office in Chamber. It's really wreaks havoc. It almost destroys it in order to preserve their existence the way it was preserved until now. They have to get rid of it because they cannot tolerate bargaining. So it's very simple, like a basic level. It's the lawyer says it destroys his reputation, but this is not the only, maybe not the reason why he wants to get rid of it. But you simply understand that with the presence of Bartleby, who chooses not to act, prefers not to act, suspend action, suspend volition, the entire business in this office will become utterly meaningless. And this, I think, is really the diagnosis of Wall Street, that what Wall Street produces is essentially meaningless.
Yeah, and you know, Bartleby is a copyist. And in some ways, you know, what he's doing is he's copying the negation of that society.
Good.
Okay, last question is Jared.
Thank you.
You come up with questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. It's actually just kind of like maybe a moment that I saw in your discussion, and that's about negativity. But one of the things in the paper that I didn't
kind of like here being taken up in the discussion is the idea of dialogue. And actually it seems like for you, Bartleby is this kind of like possibility of pure, like absolute dialogue, inexhaustible, interminable.
Exactly.
And so like when you're talking to Max about negativity, I was just thinking, okay, so if the dynamic growth model of modernity as determinate negation, so the dialectic of determinate negation, is being somehow like critiqued here, it seems like for you, it's actually this possibility of dialogue as against this notion of dialectic. And I guess partially because I just know that you've written a book about dialogue and dialectic. I'm curious, what is that like? What is it that dialogue here like represents?
Thank you, Jim. So I think there was much more that I wanted to tell you, but I skipped quite a bit. I think you're exactly right. So this is what dialogue, what Bartleby represents with his I prefer not to is kind of pure possibility in the form of dialogue as a response to the other that in principle can always be carried on, even if it seems to be abrupt, it seems to end later. And this is precisely against the idea of dialectic, because dialectic, the way it was practiced already by Plato and Socrates, is meant to be productive. So in some sense, this is a theoretical enterprise, but it means to produce. It means to produce truth and through definitions of something through negation. So this way of interrogating, so it was by kind of by suspending and rejecting the wrong thesis, wrong interpretation, then eventually coming to the right one, which is achieved along the way, and making sure that it is not self-contradictory. Now, this would be dialectic. And then when put to work to Wall Street, it produces wealth. It produces the entire contemporary world of production of finance. I think it's totally based on the idea of dialectic. But dialogue is, in my understanding, this is non-productive. It doesn't produce anything. Yeah, this is a sheer form of being as co-being with the other and the moment of communication, agreeing, disagreeing, talking about something different. It's always can be negated. We can always begin anew from something else. We basically end this conversation and stop with something. And so, in a kind of in looks at Bartleby's response is really a form of dialogue, although he seems to be abrupt. As I prefer not to. There's no continuation to the conversation, but the fact it opens the entire field of possibilities of speaking and thinking and being with others. And so I think that his kind of this word, prefer not to, is really about an invitation to be with the other, with others, which the contemporary dialectical enterprise and contemporary business model of human relation really excludes. So we constructed a world. This, I think, is why this critique is so powerful. That is very efficient. You know? It can produce a lot of things. So look how much we have produced. But it is still, it excludes a very simple thing, namely being or talking with reality. So people become atomized, they become individuals. So individual is a Latin translation of atom. So atomos is indivisible stuff that it cannot be divided. They are cut off each other when there is this invitation for pure biological being comes in with what people just reject it. They cannot accept it.
So when you say Bartleby is both symptom and critique, it's that like it can't be a critique that takes the form of determinate negation or something like that.
Is very anti-Hegelian. He doesn't want.
Yeah. You come to self-conscious.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you.